Well, welcome everyone. Welcome to the paper panel, Students, Assessments and Culture, Consideration of Validity, Fairness, and Misappropriation. My name is Gitomer. I'm at Rutgers University. I'm the chair and also co-presenter on one of our papers. I want to briefly introduce the rest of our panelists, and then we will move to the talks themselves. And then we'll have a good bit of time to actually have an open discussion. So we're looking forward to doing that as well. My co-presenter is Emi Iwatani. Emi is with Digital Promise. The second paper is going to be presented by Pōhai Kūkea Schultz and from University of Hawaii, Mānoa, and Kerry at Seneca Consulting. And our last speaker will be Hannah Valdiviejas from University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Emi, and she'll play our video. Greetings. Today, Emi Iwatani and I want to discuss what it means for assessment to be fair and equitable. We have been thinking about this issue for quite a while, and we wrote a chapter on this for a volume edited by wonderful CREA colleagues Stafford Hood, Rodney Hobson, Henry Frierson, and Kina Arbuthnot. Both of us are trained in traditional psychometrics, and there we learned a great deal about fairness and equity. But over the ensuing years, we have also engaged with CREA and others in the racial justice community, where fairness and equity are centered. So centered, in fact, that traditional tests are regularly seen as tools of unfairness and inequity. And so we came to realize that, as is true for many issues, the same words often mean very different things when we cross community boundaries. And so that brings us to today's talk. How do different communities theorize and operationalize concepts of fairness and equity in educational assessment? As we begin, we are aware, of course, that we are talking about each of these communities as homogeneous monoliths, and we understand the fallacy of that. Yet we do believe that the ideas we present do point out some key and generalizable differences that characterize the disconnects around assessment. The testing and measurement communities are those who contribute to the design, development, and research of educational assessments. They largely identify as psychometricians or test developers and are in the business and or study of tests and testing. The racial justice community members work to help elevate voices of racially marginalized groups and are critical of the contributing role of assessments in marginalization. These folks are found in universities, K-12 education, and a variety of private and public organizations committed to racial and social justice. When these two groups talk about fairness and equity, they come to different judgments about fairness and equity, largely because they are considering the issues from very different vantage points. In today's talk, we will briefly present how each of these two groups conceptualizes and problematizes fairness and equity as we describe the underlying values about fairness and equity that each community holds. Emi will start with a brief discussion of the racial justice community perspective, and then I will contrast this with fairness and equity perspectives from the testing and measurement community, and then we'll bring together these ideas to their conclusion.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk about racial justice perspectives on assessment fairness. We identified two categories of race-centered work on assessment, and I'll talk only about the first one. We focus on consequences because it's central to a racial justice perspective, and also because it's an area that measurement community folks tend to be unfamiliar with but want to better understand. The definition of racial justice is that it's the systematic fair treatment of people of all races, resulting in equitable opportunities and outcomes for all. It's not just about there being no racism, it's about there being systems and supports to promote racial justice. So when we consider that definition, what might assessment fairness mean? Well, at minimum, assessment and assessment systems should not hinder progress towards racial justice. This means however precise and accurate an assessment score might be, if it's getting in the way of equitable opportunities and outcomes, it doesn't seem fair. Which means looking at consequences of assessment is of utmost importance for racial justice advocates, although the measurement community hardly ever does so. There are three types of assessment consequences that the racial justice community seem concerned about. It took us a while to arrive at these categories because there's no clean presentation anywhere about this. So we are interested to know whether you find it helpful and reasonable. This first category of concern is something that a CREA colleague in our last conference helped me better understand. And I think the way they phrased it is, just because my group keeps scoring low on these tests, it doesn't mean we're second-class citizens. Assessments are useful if they can identify and explain racial injustice, and they're used to prescribe justice. And that is often the point of doing assessment. But it's important to consider the potential psychological harm that scores might bring to racial and other subgroups, especially if they're scoring low, and especially when this message is repeated over and over and no progress seems to be made. If the message gets internalized as I'm not good enough, my school is a bad school, my group is a second-class citizen, that is a serious consequence which hinders rather than supports racial justice. It's a type of consequence that's hard to undo and can take resources away from communities of color because they'll have to put in extra efforts into counteracting this kind of messaging. A second type of assessment consequence that racial justice community folks might care about is that assessments can impose cultural and ideological assimilation. Many CREA colleagues, including those listed here and folks like David Saul, have been talking about this. A few background points before going into how this might be the case. The first point is that ideologies are presumed in the design and use of assessments, and some examples of ideologies are listed on this slide. And depending on who you are, it might be easy or hard to understand that ideologies and values play a very large role in how we experience the world and what we know from it. And although communicating where those differences are and why that matters is very difficult, at least in my opinion. If the goal is to have dialogue across difference and to make assessments useful, I think it's unproductive to hold and intellectually hard to defend extreme positions on objectivity and relativism. So something like all truth is relative, everyone has their own truth and will never agree on anything is hard to defend, just as it's hard to defend a view that says there's only one correct way to see the world. And that's something I think worth keeping in mind. The second point is that some important cultural constructs are not included in testing, and they might not even be testable. So there are at least three ways that assessments may contribute to imposition of cultural and ideological assimilation. First, assessments can get people so focused on teaching what's on the test, and so take away resources and attention from educational activities that are important to minoritized communities. Second, there's a lot of intergenerational trauma, especially for Indigenous and Black communities, around state-sanctioned initiatives deciding their lives and livelihoods, not to mention the origin of assessment and eugenics. If assessment initiatives are about standardization, resource allocation, and then this can sound very similar to those state-sanctioned, unfair, and traumatizing mandates from the past, and it might cause harm through re-traumatization. So any new efforts must take into account this legacy of intergenerational trauma when designing assessment policies targeting particular communities, especially when they involve testing and standardization. And the third point is that assessments can make it sound like assertions of individuals, groups, and institutions are more definite than they are. As some quant crit colleagues will say, numbers are not neutral. Also, assessments are cultural artifacts that are value laden, and assessment scores always have error. But few people understand all of this. So the numbers can come off as being more definite than they are, and they can convey certain messages more strongly than others. This third negative consequence is perhaps the most widely discussed, partly because it's about money, resources, and employment opportunities. So it's very tangible and easy to see, then impacts on psychology and ideology. And also the links between these kinds of consequences listed here and assessment practices might also be more direct. So we've all heard stories about test stress for students and teachers, narrowing the curriculum to focus on test prep, eradication of arts and other valuable learning opportunities that aren't easily tested, Test-based descriptions of school quality have had impacts on real estate values systematically, and ultimately school funding tax bases are impacted as well. And test scores have been used as a basis for closing schools that serve minoritized students. The concern to racial justice advocates is that these kinds of consequences, they could in theory happen to everyone, but they often happen disproportionately to Black and Brown students in their communities. Passing it to Drew.
Okay, so Emmy's comments stand in stark contrast with the measurement perspective, which is one in which fairness is highly constrained and is focused on ensuring that scores from a given test have particular meaning, and that the meaning is the same for all examinees, regardless of any population characteristics, for example, gender, race, linguistic background. What we see here are the standards from the educational and psychological testing, which talks about scores having common meaning for all individuals in an intended population, and that there is not irrelevant information that affects the judgment or the scores about an individual. And so what we try to do is identify key facets of fairness and equity that can provide a basis for comparison between the two communities. And so what I want to do is summarize where the measurement community sits with respect to these facets, and then you can contrast it with the perspective that Emmy shared with us. First, we can ask, what is the overarching concern with respect to fairness? For the measurement community, it's that scores have the same meaning. No matter who takes an assessment, a given score leads to the same interpretation of what someone knows or can do. Now, one of the striking things we note about the measurement community in general, in its standards and key texts on validity, is the silence on issues of the role tests have played with respect to issues of race, power, and dominance. The primary purpose of assessment has always been to support decisions of institutions, to support institutions in the work they do, which has inevitably been to support the status quo of a society that has provided privilege for some at the expense of others. When the measurement community considers unfairness, it is that scores do not support the intended meaning, and the focus is on the individual test, not testing at large. The measurement community has developed sets of procedures, all designed to support consistent score meaning for all examinees. Of course, for the measurement community, there is an inherent belief in the positive value of tests. Finally, testing as we know it was developed almost entirely by white men. Over the years, more women have become involved, and of course, in the US and other countries, we also see significant contributions from those of Asian descent. However, the presence of participants from marginalized communities continues to be very low. So with that, we also need to think about the next steps for assessment and racial justice. And we've identified 5 steps that we think are important. First, it's important to use a racial justice framework to explain differential performance of groups. We need to develop tests and assessment in ways that take into account the cultural backgrounds of examinees. We need to acknowledge and understand the historical and racist legacy of assessment and make committed efforts not to repeat those sins. We need to examine the consequences of test use as part of validation. Historically, test use has been part of validity considerations in theory, but not nearly as taken seriously and consistently in practice. And finally, we need to work as an assessment community in true partnership, centering those most adversely impacted by assessment consequences. So on behalf of Emmy and myself, thank you. Okay, so Rosetta, you'll play the next presentation?
Is that Hannah?
No, this would be Pōhai and Kerry.
Yes.
Great.
We go. Okay, aloha kako. My name is Pōhai Kūkea Schultz, and I'm here with Dr. Kerry Englert. And thank you for joining us for this quick 12-minute presentation. And today we're gonna talk about including student perspectives and cultural validity, particularly cultural and community validity. So thanks for joining us for this quick 12-minute talk. Okay, so first I wanted to set up basically the context, and it's impossible for us to do that in 12 minutes, but I'm going to do my best to sort of sprint through the contextual part of our work. And so we work in developing the Kaipuni assessment of educational outcomes, which is a Hawaiian language assessment that's been developed for the Hawaiian immersion schools for the purposes of state and federal accountability. Now, this work sort of is built on some policy foundations that have already been set in the state of Hawaii, including the fact that the Hawaiian language is an official language of our state, and that there is a Board of Education policy that requires the Department of Education to develop an assessment in Hawaiian for the purposes of state and federal accountability. However, that hasn't always been the case. And so this timeline that you see here, and hopefully we will be able to provide kind of this handout timeline for you folks to take a better look at. Just sort of highlights the timeline of the assessment. So many of us have lived through the No Child Left Behind Act and the federal mandates in terms of accountability and testing. So Hawaiian immersion schools were no different, but the difference is that the medium of instruction in Hawaiian immersion schools is Hawaiian. And so our students were on this roller coaster of when it came to assessment in terms of what their assessments looked like. So because of NCLB, Hawaiian immersion or Kaipuni students, as we call them, were either required to take an English test, which is not their language of instruction. Sometimes in some years, they were required to take a test that was translated from English into Hawaiian, which never worked. There was a period of time where they took a Hawaiian language test called HAPA that was developed in the Hawaiian language by teachers, but there were some technical issues and some resourcing issues, and HAPA was discontinued in 2011, and children went back to having to take tests either in English or translated tests. Because of community advocacy and strong community advocacy, the Board of Education in the state of Hawaii redrafted their policies in 2014. And that policy redrafted a number of things for the Hawaiian Immersion program. But one of the things that it did was require the department, as I mentioned earlier, to develop assessments in the Hawaiian language for the purposes of state and federal accountability. So that's when our work really starts with CREA in 2014. And we started with the development of just grades, tests for grades 3 and 4 in language arts, math, and science. And the reason for that start, that kind of odd start in grades 3 and 4, is that students learn through the medium of Hawaiian exclusively until 5th grade. English is not introduced until a separate subject area until the 5th grade. So it was critically important that, particularly for those students, that they were not assessed in a language that did not match their language of instruction. So the project started with grades 3 and 4. And then in 2017, the department made an additional commitment to expand these assessments all the way up until grade 8. So here we are in 2021. And students in the Hawaiian Immersion program take tests that are developed in Hawaiian by Hawaiian Immersion experts and educators and community members in language arts, mathematics, and science in grades 5-8. And so that's sort of the context under which we are working. And then we're going to kind of move on now and sort of talk about the elephant in the room, which is the pandemic. So with that, I'm going to pass the ball over to Kerry.
Thank you so much, Pōhai. And as Pōhai was talking, it really reminds me of just the long road that the community has walked to get to this point where there's self-determination in this assessment program. And the community continues to walk on that path towards equity. And as we think about the twin pandemic that's really put a spotlight on those racial and economic disparities for the country as a whole, it's also specifically impacted Kaipuni students as well. And Pōhai is going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. But the pandemic has really impacted instruction in immersion schools. And this has really emphasized the importance of providing data to schools that is really relevant and meaningful. And it will support the schools hopefully forward past this pandemic. The pandemic has also really re-emphasized the need to think about the content of those assessments and to do it in a way that's both supportive and informative, and also really highlights the brilliance of the Kaipuni students. And it's true for Kaipuni students as well as students from other marginalized groups. So I don't profess to have all the answers, but I just think it's so important for educators to come together on this issue because of all the important ways we use assessment data. If it's accountability or classroom instruction, it's really critical to get that right. And I offer this quote from Amy Stuart Wells because it resonates with that, with a moment. And she says, what if testing and the way we have trained accountability in education is just the latest manifestation of maintaining racial segregation and inequality? And I think it really takes your breath away to think about that impact. When we think about validity, kind of moving forward, we're attempting to do this with CREA in 2 ways, and to really expand the idea of validity. First, we're looking at cultural validity, which provides a way to view and reflect on cultural issues related to an assessment. So, for example, our science assessment really highlighted the Hawaiian context and being really inclusive of Native vision and Native wisdom. The second is through community validity, which is really about inviting stakeholders into the assessment development process as partners, really. And this really helps us ensure that their priority for their students' education is included in the assessment. And I think as educators, we really need to start considering different ways and creative ways to make assessments more relevant to all students from all groups. And so the way of bringing in community and culture really resonates with that idea. And I am going to turn it back over to Pōhai to talk about some of the data collection that we're doing around, as we move through the pandemic, around opportunity to learn.
Great, thanks, Kerry. Okay, so when we submitted this proposal back in 2019, there was no pandemic on the horizon. And so we intended to talk about some of the cognitive interview work that we've done with students. But as you know, in 2020, things just shut down. We didn't have access to students in the same way. We weren't able to conduct cognitive interviews in the same way. So rather than presenting on data that we had from 2018 and 2019, we shifted our focus a bit, and our work shifted too. And we really focused in on the importance of collecting opportunity to learn data to really understand like some of these things that Kerry has been talking about in terms of the inequities that exist in our educational system, but to really understand the things that had been going on in our community and how we were gonna help them interpret results based on the impacts of the pandemic. So we started, and we've been taking surveys of our students and our teachers for a while that are related to external validity. And so this wasn't really much of a leap for us in terms of sort of our normal process. And so what we really wanted to know was not just how the pandemic impacted instruction and instructional hours and engagement of students and all of those things, but we also really wanted to dig deep into the impacts that the pandemic has had on students' language learning, because Kaipuni students have been differentially impacted by the pandemic because of this additional piece, which is their language proficiency and their language learning has been impacted. And so we started this work by taking some initial surveys in the fall of our large stakeholder group that included administrators, teachers, parents, and community. We did another based on those results, we did another follow-up survey in the fall, and we included test coordinators in that group because we brought them together for a training. So we figured why not, or actually in the spring, I guess that was in February. And then with all of those results, we took a survey of teachers and of students during the testing window. And so that happened in spring during that testing window. And I'm just going to share quickly just some of the general results that we found. The first thing was we asked some questions about the impacts to students' learning, to their academic proficiency and their engagement. And our stakeholder groups, made up of teachers and parents, and also test coordinators that we asked, really honed in on three things. And these are things that, I think we sort of inherently already know. One is that it had a deep impact to hands-on learning. So in the Kaipuni program, we place high value on project-based learning. We place high value on going outside and exploring our environment. And all of those things just kind of came to a screeching halt during the pandemic. The other impact had to do with the home environment. And this is the one that's a real kick in the gut, because what you don't realize is about some of our families is some of them, they were all home, all of their kids, 7 people in the house. And it's difficult to see this quote, but 7 people in the house, all trying to access one wireless point. So the home environment really did have an impact on the way that students learned and how much they were able to engage in their learning because of the number of people in their home, their access to technology, and other things. The third thing was really about the technology learning curve. And I think all teachers experienced this during the pandemic. One day they were teaching in their classroom and the next day they were home and they had to suddenly be distance learning teachers. And so that technology learning curve definitely had an impact, not just on the teachers, but also on the students in their ability to engage in school. So these are sort of those top 3 impacts. We also looked at, as I mentioned before, the impacts to language proficiency. And so this is where we see a lot of sort of differential impacts that happened to Kaipuni students. So obviously there was less time speaking Hawaiian. So in a normal environment, kids are in school for 6 hours a day surrounded by Hawaiian. That may not be the case if they don't live in a Hawaiian speaking household. So there were impacts to the amount of time that they spoke Hawaiian. There was impacts to their focus during learning if they had internet issues. And then there were also impacts to attendance. So students just not being able to log on, or when they did, being disrupted and then being logged off. So all of these things, like this contact, this immersive environment that existed pre-pandemic, was significantly impacted when instruction was only delivered online. And so from those surveys, we then we took additional surveys, as I mentioned, in spring of students and teachers. And the results we're still analyzing, but the results are really similar to what we found in those initial surveys. Is there impacts to language use, there's impacts to engagement and learning, and all of these things we hope to further explore in what we're doing. So I'm going to try to wrap it up as quickly as I can, but really, what are we doing this for? What are we collecting this data for? So it's really an opportunity for us to understand the educational context and then help our stakeholders understand that educational context, to look at the results of their students after the administration of an assessment and make some sense of it based on what we've been through this past year and a half, right? We hope to also be able to use this to improve the resiliency and the sustainability of the program and support teachers and learning. And really what we want to be able to do is use this as part of our validity argument, that community, engaging community in this conversation, tapping into our community to find out the impacts of the pandemic are the things that add to the validity of the assessment, not take away. And so really that's the goal. What are we doing this for? Well, we're doing it to build our validity argument, because we cannot have a validity argument without culture and community embedded in that as the foundation of what we do. At least that's kind of the foundation of how we've built this assessment. So with that, this is a fast 12 minutes, maybe a little longer. And we'd like to really thank you for taking part in this presentation, and we hope to be able to have a further conversation in this session. Mahalo.
Thank you so much. We're going to have our last presentation, and this is Hannah Valdiviejas. Hannah's not with us in the room right now, so hopefully we can locate her and she will be here, but otherwise I had a chance to look at some of her stuff and it promises to be very interesting. So we'll just move to Hannah and then we'll open it up for discussion. As we're going along, also, if folks want to put anything in the chat boxes, please feel free to do so. Okay, Rosetta, you got this, right? Rosetta.
And this talk is language as a resource
starting.
through the
Let me start
constructivist
again.
perspective. So as a quick overview, bilingual education has been a controversial topic in the United States around issues dealing with.
Apologies. I will restart.
Hello, everybody. My name is Hannah Valdiviejas, and I am from the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And this talk is language as a resource through the constructivist perspective. So as a quick overview, bilingual education has been a controversial topic in the United States around issues dealing with sociopolitics, academic achievement, cultural identity, labor market preparedness, and all of those kind of stemming and dealing with the lasting legacy of colonization. But for the sake of this talk, I will only be discussing academic achievement. And so I will advocate for the importance of seeing language as a resource rather than a deficit for academic achievement. And when we adopt that stance, not only does it promote cultural and identity pride, as well as substantial economic benefit and cognitive benefits, but it would also optimize the efficiency of bilingual classroom instruction, especially in abstract subjects like mathematics. So based on the notion that language is a resource, academic achievement, the idea of productive struggle from the constructivist frameworks should be considered when assessing bilingual student achievement. So just as a quick overview of the bilingual education models that we have in the United States, have or had, they kind of go on a spectrum from the least culturally responsive and the least culturally responsive to the most culturally responsive. So the first one is the submersion or the sink or swim method, which was really popular in the 60s up until about the 90s. Is when non-English speaking students have a short window before they are put into mainstream English speaking classes with the assumption that they could either learn or be forced to fall behind in the content. And so even now today, in 2015, 11% of English language learners nationwide in the US do not receive any specialized language instruction at all. So they go to school districts that adopt the sink or swim method. And this is problematic, but this is not what I will be talking about in this talk. Next, we have the ESL, or the English as a Second Language program, which is when students are either pulled out of class or have a special aid to receive additional instruction in how to learn English. So they miss out on classroom content and classroom time to learn about an hour a day, some English lessons. Next, we have the early exit approach, or transitional bilingual education. And this is where students are instructed in their native language, but this language is quickly phased out by second or third grade. And this is popular in metropolitan areas that are not politically progressive. So a lot of southern cities adopt this way. And then we have maintenance or dual language immersion. And this is one-way or two-way dual language immersion. Those are the two facets of this program. And the one-way dual language program is for only bilinguals. And then the two-way dual language program is where bilinguals and English monolinguals are combined in class together. And so both of these branches of the dual language immersion programs are usually taught in 80-20 models, meaning that in kindergarten, 80% of their content is taught in Spanish, if it's a Spanish-English dual immersion program, and then 20% is taught in English, and then with every grade, so that by first grade, they're taught in a 70-30, fifth grade, they're taught in a, it just keeps going up until in fifth grade, it's 50-50. And so for the sake of this talk, I'll be talking about dual language immersion education. And so more specifically, this is where students maintain their native language while learning their second language, with the goal that by fifth grade, as I mentioned before, the students are 100% bilingual and biliterate. And so there's a large emphasis on academic language literacy, because even if you're a Spanish speaker, you come in almost 100% Spanish speaker and barely know any English. The idea of a dual language program is that you can still develop your academic Spanish, so that you're not bilingual in an informal way, but you have the language competency to be academically bilingual as well, not just conversationally. And so this program does emphasize the language as a resource perspective. However, there are issues related to the assessment of these students' intelligence and achievement in these programs. So, for example, many times the beneficial effects of dual language programs are not seen until fifth grade. So when school districts do state testing, first, second, third, fourth grade, a lot of times the students in dual language programs underperform. However, by fifth grade, the beneficial effects of being 100% bilingual start to show. And so this is kind of a hiccup in the assessment, and researchers should try to are looking into why this is the case. But then there's also issues with how strict the boundaries are between English and Spanish time. If, like I said, my examples will always be English and Spanish, but there are dual language programs that are English and Polish, or other languages as well. But so for example, if it's an 80-20 model, often the students will be taught Spanish, or will be taught math in Spanish, and then all other subjects in English. So there's a strict divide with subjects and languages. Or sometimes there's a strict divide in younger classes with objects. So like a lot of the times a teacher will have like this magical object, like a scarf. And when the teacher is wearing the scarf, then the student should speak Spanish. And when the teacher is not wearing the scarf, then the student should speak English. And so while this seems efficient on paper, I argue that is incongruent with how bilinguals think. So I don't believe that there is a time when bilinguals think entirely in English versus entirely in Spanish, especially if you're developing both languages at the same time. And so I argue that this is a conflict with the language as a resource and the use of productive struggle. So language as a resource and constructivism. So under the constructivist paradigm, student struggle or temporary failure is important to learning because failure is an opportunity for students to kind of wake up, realize their faulty logic, and kind of fix buggy conclusions. According to constructivists, the basic formula for learning is number 1, elicit prior knowledge. Number 2, create cognitive dissonance or cognitive discomfort. Number 3, the application of new knowledge with feedback. And then finally, number 4, metacognition, where the student reflects on their learning and then they go back to step 1. And so under this constructivist paradigm, it looks kind of like a bell curve where if the concept is too difficult, then the struggle is not productive, and then there's not a lot of learning. And then on the other side, if the task is too easy and there's not any struggle, then the student won't learn either. And so there's this kind of sweet spot in the middle where there's struggle, but it's not too much, where the student can kind of get out of it, and that's optimal learning. And so kind of put into context, if a student does not have adequate prior knowledge in a language, for example, the student does not know how to explain themselves in a dominant language or does not understand the meaning of a given question because it's in English, for example, the student will be too overwhelmed. So it's too cognitively demanding. And so the lack of linguistic prior knowledge may create this double discomfort. And then the mathematical problem, for example, is too difficult. And so this is an example of how if a student cannot use their linguistic repertoire in a language that they're comfortable with, as well as language that they're not, that they're uncomfortable with, then the task will be too difficult. And so language as a resource as it relates to assessment. So for example, in bilingual education, particularly in Illinois, where I'm located, they use a WIDA screener to decipher whether a student qualifies for the bilingual program. And so it is an assessment of some sort. And so they test the student on listening, speaking, reading, and writing in English. So this is definitely a problem under the assumption that students should be able to use both language repertoires as evidence of intelligence. And so research shows that constant switching between languages that bilinguals do has metacognitive functions, which are essential to deeper learning and long-term comprehension. So for example, a lot of words in Spanish are more transparent and are more intuitive than words in English. Like for example, par, impar in Spanish for odd and even, it's very intuitive in the wording, whereas odd and even, it takes more understanding of the deeper meaning of what the word means. And so for example, for the sake of time, I won't go over this, but so Planas did a study where she showed that students in Catalan or Catalunya in Spain, where they speak Catalan, and then in the same classroom there was Spanish speakers, and so they were learning math, and there was a lot of productive struggle going on, even though the Spanish speakers were in the minority and they needed a lot more help. But at the end of the day, the conversations that they were having contributed greatly to their mathematical understanding. And so when teachers do not consider students' linguistic knowledge in instruction and assessment, they're likely to view their students' confusions or interventions as an error rather than intelligent inquiry, which is an erroneous conclusion, and it could harm the students in the long run. And so some proposed models for how this language as a resource could inform assessment is that leaving it up to the disclosure of the student to use their various languages as mathematical, for example, resources, and it produces optimal productive struggle and therefore optimal learning. And so I say that it is outdated to have strict boundaries between languages when assessing achievement intelligence of dual language students. So for the future, I would suggest work that addresses the cognitive benefits of fluid boundaries between language use, so code switching, work that creates ways to develop teachers' understanding and appreciation of linguistic code switching as it relates to intelligent inquiry, inquiry, and also work that creates culturally responsive assessments that do not perpetuate strict linguistic boundaries as the standard. And so I apologize for the speed. I thank you for the time to present, and please feel free to reach out to me at my email, hsb2@illinois.edu.
Dr. Gitomer, you're on mute.
Okay, thank you so much. Sorry about that. I want to thank everybody for the presentation, and I'd like to turn this over to our the folks in the audience who might have questions or comments, and please throw that to anybody, but please be mindful that Hannah is not here. And if you'd like to raise your hand in the chat, we can call on you, or it's a small enough group that people can just, I think, pop in. Okay. Any comments from the speakers? Do you guys have any thoughts?
I'm happy to jump in. Thank you so much, Drew. Thank you for facilitating. This was such an interesting session. And I'm just wondering if anyone in the audience or any of the panelists have any thoughts, ideas, suggestions for concrete actions we can take to, I don't know, communicate with a broader measurement community. I guess I'm feeling, and I would only say this to my CREA family, but feeling a little frustration or anger about how the larger measurement community moves forward, or the lack of, and I forget, you had that in your presentation, Drew, there's sort of silence from the larger measurement community on some of these issues. And I don't know if there are any ways that we can, as a collective, kind of move the needle on that.
I can take a little stab at that. I think there are some small efforts going on in the measurement community, but I think they're peripheral efforts for sure. And it's not going to happen. I don't think it's going to be driven by the traditional measurement folks. I mean, these folks are trained in certain kinds of ways. They have particular kinds of toolkits. They conceptualize problems in the way that they know how to conceptualize problems. So I think that voices from this community and other kinds of communities can bring people who have certain kinds of training in, but it as much as there's at least some rhetoric to say that certain things have to be dealt with within the measurement community, I think it's largely rhetorical, and I don't think there's a deep understanding. And I think that the kinds of things that the ideas that come in throughout CREA are not the ones that are being asked, and those sensibilities just aren't highly developed. And it's not part of the regular training. There are some programs that are starting to do some of this, but that's just, it's a different kind of problems that they're trying to solve. And historically, that's been the case. So I think, the work that you guys are doing, where you're looking at context, but it's not context to sort of just explain scores as covariates. You're looking at context to really understand, and culture and context to understand things in a very deep way. And I think that that's not the natural inclination. So it's going to be a long slog, but I think ultimately it's not going to be driven by the measurement community. There may be some folks in the audience who have different, or can you add to this?
I'll just add, I do feel a little bit more hopeful, and I think it's largely thanks to Black Lives Matters and 2019, 2020, my 2020, the huge kind of movement that's and shifts and attention that it has helped raise across the country. And so even if you look at, I would think, the NCME program from this year to prior years where there was nothing, and I have looked through a number of years of programming to try to find like-minded colleagues in the past, and I realized, like, okay, I'm not attending this conference. And but I think there are much more awareness that's finally happening belatedly in the measurement community. I think the next conference theme is also more focused on equity, and then there's little groups popping up outside from. So I think there's a little bit more reason for hope, and I do agree with Drew that it's important for this community to also be there and to engage in the conversation and drive it, not be auxiliary to the movement. There was something else I was going to say, but I can't remember. I will share if I think of it. And I do think there are some, so I think a lot of graduate programming, there's attention to graduate programs not training people and broadening folks' minds and being very, very narrow and just doing the computational exercises. And in Boston College and Duquesne University, there are courses, and I think there's to try to include or be more critical of statistics and measurement, and graduate courses already have been implemented, and I think there's some efforts to try to spread that as well. So that also gives me a little bit hope too.
Yeah, I mean, where there may be some connections there in the areas of formative assessment sorts of approaches. I mean, if you listen to all of the discussions at CREA, for example, it's about how can assessment really support students and support teachers in helping students. Or it's not the kind of thing, if it is true, like Amy says, there are increasing number of sessions, but there's a lot of sessions about how do we get more precise estimates of students. That's the psychometric problem, the measurement community's problem. Can we really precisely estimate where a student is with respect to what on a test? And when we come to the discussions in CREA, there's much less focus on these kinds of large testing systems and much more about how do we get assessment information that's going to be immediately useful inside of schools. And it's not like psychometrics and the measurement community doesn't talk about that. But the models that are still used, I think, are much, they're still the tools of efficiency to give items that you can give to students and do that. And they're not embedded and wrapped in the kinds of culture, community, and language kinds of things that all come out in sessions like this. And so moving to that is to challenge also the basic kinds of purposes and uses of assessment that have driven the business of assessment in large ways.
Drew, there's there's some interesting things in the chat, and I was
Okay.
wondering if we could hear a little bit more, maybe from Pamela and Jennifer,
Please.
if you're willing to come on audio and let us know your question, and Jennifer, what a little bit more of what you've been up to.
So yeah, I'll just speak briefly here. We'll be presenting some of the initial findings from this work tomorrow morning, I think at the 10 a.m. session. But we got disrupted by COVID for sure. But what we were doing, or what we are doing, is observing students in their classrooms, interviewing families multiple times about the things that matter to them, what they do on a daily basis with respect to work and to family and to community engagement, and developing measures of, we started with first graders, computational thinking. So taking that information and designing assessment items that are really more formative and diagnostic than anything, not intended to be summative, but really to get a sense of how do students think computationally within the context of their own community, and what is valued within their communities, which is very different from the ways in which computational thinking is typically assessed in first grade students. So it's always kind of outside of their own experience is how we tend to measure it. And so what we're trying to figure out, we're really at the proof of concept moving into pilot phase, is can we do this? Or rather how to do it. It's certainly, there's no doubt that it can be done, but really fumbling around trying to figure out how to do it in a way that gets us the information that we need, that we can build on with these students as we move forward.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. And I would just recommend go listen to Jennifer. She's doing some phenomenal work. So if you can get to her session, you should do that. We probably have time for one more comment. Pamela, would you? Pamela? Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Gitomer. Yes, it's Pamela, and really glad to be able to attend this session, and really appreciated presentations from Pōhai and me, yourself, Dr. Gitomer, and Kerry. Just was wondering about what cultural validity and community validity can really look like, as we also struggle here in Seattle, Tacoma area, working with communities to lift their concerns and their needs. We have, as most of you have, probably a lot of children, very young children, who are immigrants, new immigrants to the area, and there are many models of early childhood education that requires that these children be tested and assessed frequently, which to me is already kind of concerning, but that they are constantly assessed for expressive and receptive language, and the usual using Peabody picture vocabulary test and all. And I'm just worried about, first of all, the frequency, and again, just trying to understand what the relationship between what parents are hoping for their children, which I know is success, to become school ready and ready for kindergarten and onwards, and but not also promoting, as one of your presenters said today, I think Hannah, about having their languages be a resource. You know, we were asking about interpreters as part of those assessments, the frequent assessments, and I'm sorry, that's my particular annoyance about the frequency. But we were told that it's about assessing their English language abilities. And so I just was wondering how to kind of interrupt that by really talking about or presenting the value of what all of you have talked about, the cultural validity, the context, the community needs. So was really just interested in all your experiences. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Pamela. I don't think we have time to answer that, but hopefully we can continue those conversations over the course of the meeting, but also going forward. Thank you all for attending. Rosetta, thank you so much for making this thing happen and coordinating and administering this. And I wish everybody, thanks to the presenters, you guys are great. And thank you to, I just wish you all a great conference and enjoy. So we're going to sign off here and move on.